Welcome to the debate. Today we're looking at the escalating military confrontation between the United States and Iran. This is a crisis that has rapidly, almost dizzyingly, really expanded well beyond its initial parameters. Because while missiles and drones are commanding the physical battlefield right now, there was a massive parallel diplomatic theater that has opened up alongside it.
And it is a very crowded theater. You have global powers, specifically Russia and China, stepping forward, making these very public offers of mediation. But at the exact same time, they are clearly pursuing their own strategic interests in the region.
Exactly. We are looking at a conflict operating on multiple levels at once. And that brings us to the central question we're exploring today. Is the primary barrier to resolving this conflict the irreconcilable, completely divergent realities of the direct combatants, meaning the United States and Iran? Or is this prolonged crisis primarily being driven and complicated by the strategic opportunism of external global powers, like Russia and China? I will be arguing that the conflict is fundamentally stalled because Washington and Tehran have mutually exclusive strategic objectives and wildly contradictory assessments of what is actually happening on the battlefield.
And I will be arguing that the true complexity of this crisis stems from those external powers, namely that Russia and China are using this conflict as a geopolitical instrument to reshape the global order and actively challenge United States' influence in the Middle East.
To really get to the bottom of this, I think we have to start by looking squarely at the two primary actors engaged in the direct hostilities. When you examine the rhetoric, the stated positions of the United States and Iran, you are essentially looking at two entirely different universes.
The gap between their public statements is staggering.
It really is. From the United States' perspective, the administration is projecting absolute, unquestionable military dominance. President Trump has publicly characterized the ongoing war as an excursion. He stated that it will be over soon, specifically framing the timeline in a matter of days.
Which is a remarkable choice of words for a major regional conflict. I mean, excursion sounds like a weekend trip, not a heavy military engagement.
Right. It completely downplays the scale. And he goes further, asserting that two levels of Iranian leadership, maybe even more, are entirely gone. He stated plainly that everything they have is gone. So you have a U.S. assessment that points to a swift, total decapitation of the opponent. But then contrast that staggering assessment of victory with the perspective emanating from Tehran right now.
It is the exact opposite narrative.
Completely. Foreign Minister Syed Abbas Araghchi, speaking recently to PBS News, made it unequivocally clear that negotiations with the United States are completely off the agenda. The Iranian Foreign Ministry insists that Iran holds the upper hand. They claim to have inflicted severe economic and energy losses on America and its allies, delivering what they call truly devastating blows.
And this is where the core of your argument really takes shape, right? The incompatible realities.
Yes. The main takeaway here is that both sides are operating on entirely different scoreboards. The United States is keeping score with military targets and leadership decapitation. Iran is keeping score with global economic pain and energy market disruption. When one side believes they have wiped out the opponent's leadership and the other side believes they've crippled the opponent's economy and hold absolute leverage, well, you simply do not have the baseline reality required to even sit at a table. You can't end a game if the players don't even agree on what sport they are playing. That fundamental psychological disconnect is the primary barrier to peace.
I come at it from a different way. While that bilateral rhetoric is undeniably polarized, focusing solely on Washington and Tehran misses the broader architectural shift happening right around them. The geopolitical maneuvering of external actors is what actually transforms this from a localized regional clash into a systemic global crisis.
How so?
Well, look at the duality of Russia's involvement right now. On one hand, you have the Kremlin aggressively positioning itself as the responsible peacemaker. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov stated that Russia has been offering mediation since before the military phase even began. He noted that several proposals remain on the table and that resolving the crisis will require multiple agreements. President Putin even called President Trump directly to discuss de-escalation.
It certainly looks like a robust diplomatic push on the surface.
On the surface, yes. But beneath that diplomatic veneer lies a profound contradiction. At the exact same time, Putin is making phone calls about peace. You have U.S. envoy Steve Witko openly raising concerns that Moscow could be sharing targeting intelligence with Iran, helping Iranian forces strike American positions.
Which completely undermines the concept of a neutral mediator.
Exactly. And furthermore, let's look at the economics. As a major energy exporter, Russia directly benefits from the higher global oil prices driven by this very conflict. And then you pivot to China's strategic positioning. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is calling for an immediate ceasefire, but he pairs that call with incredibly pointed warnings against color revolutions and regime change.
He is actively utilizing the crisis to promote Beijing's global security initiative.
Spot on. These external powers are not merely bystanders trying to hand out olive branches. They are actively entangled in the crisis, utilizing the instability to drain U.S. resources and rewrite the rules of Middle Eastern security.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. If we look at the actual mechanics of diplomacy right now, the reason external mediation is failing has nothing to do with Russian or Chinese grand strategy. It is failing entirely because of Iran's explicit preconditions and its absolute refusal to engage.
You don't think the mediators' hidden agendas are the primary roadblock?
Not currently, no, because the mediators aren't even getting in the door. The Iranian Foreign Ministry has stated on the record that they have received and outright refused requests for a ceasefire from France, Russia, and China. Tehran's position is that the cessation of the war is entirely in their hands. They are demanding that the United States accept full responsibility for the conflict and provide ironclad guarantees against future aggression before any cessation of hostilities can even be discussed.
Which is a massive demand.
The phone unless the U.S. essentially surrenders and admits total fault. They have explicitly stated it's not like they'll just come today and say stop and cease fire and we'll say very well. When a combatant takes a position demanding unconditional capitulation from the opposing superpower, external diplomacy is basically dead in the water. Russia and China can propose all the multi-stage frameworks they want, but until Washington and Tehran shift their internal calculations, those diplomatic channels are irrelevant.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The diplomatic failure you were describing is actually a symptom of these deeply entangled global interests. You argue that the direct combatants are ignoring the mediators, but the mediators themselves are bringing massive geopolitical baggage to the table, which poisons the well of diplomacy from the start.
Poisoning the well how?
Consider President Trump's response to Vladimir Putin's direct offer of mediation. Trump confirmed the conversation, acknowledged that the Russian leader wants to be helpful, but what did he do next? He immediately pivoted to suggest that Russia could do more by first ending its war in Ukraine.
That was a striking pivot.
It was incredibly revealing. That interaction alone proves that this Middle East conflict has been inextricably hijacked by unrelated global disputes. We are dealing with a proxy conflict, a situation where major powers use a third party as a substitute for fighting each other directly. The United States cannot cleanly negotiate a de-escalation with Iran via Russia because the U.S. and Russia are locked in their own proxy conflict in Eastern Europe.
So you are saying the diplomatic architecture itself is fundamentally compromised?
Precisely. The channels aren't just failing because Iran is being stubborn. When a mediator is simultaneously accused of providing targeting data to one of the combatants, as Envoy Witko suggested regarding Moscow and Tehran, it is no longer traditional mediation. It is shadow warfare. It is playing both sides in the dark.
Let's examine the premise of that shadow warfare, though, by returning to the immediate material conditions of the combatants. The psychological disconnect I mentioned earlier, the different scoreboards, isn't just rhetoric. It is sustaining the physical continuation of the war. We really have to look at the vastly different assessments of battlefield realities versus economic realities.
You're talking about Trump's claims of tactical success versus Iran's claims of economic damage?
Exactly. Trump is operating on an assessment of complete tactical success. He claims the Iranian military infrastructure is decimated. Yet, interestingly, the source material notes a Wall Street Journal report indicating that his own advisors are urging him to exit the war.
Which highlights a fascinating internal tension in Washington.
It really does. It suggests a tension between the stated public victory, the excursion that is supposedly over, and the strategic desire among his staff to avoid a protracted quagmire. But regardless of what his advisors are saying behind closed doors, Trump's public posture is one of overwhelming victory. Now switch back to Iran. They are not pointing to battlefield victories in the traditional sense of taking territory or destroying U.S. bases. They are pointing to the state of the global economy and energy markets. They believe they have successfully weaponized the global economy against the U.S. and its allies.
And they feel that is enough to claim they hold the upper hand.
Right. This mutual, simultaneous belief in imminent victory, one based on tactical military decapitation, the other based on systemic economic pain, is exactly what prevents de-escalation. Why would you stop fighting if you genuinely believe you are currently winning?
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered how perfectly Iran's claims of inflicting painful losses on the global energy sector align with Russia's core economic interests?
Go on.
You just mentioned that Iran is banking on the economic pain caused by disrupted energy markets. Well, we have to ask, who is the primary beneficiary of a disrupted global energy market? Russia. The source material explicitly notes that the conflict has driven global oil prices higher. For Russia, a major energy exporter currently facing immense Western sanctions, this is a massive financial lifeline.
So you are suggesting their mediation is essentially a stalling tactic?
I think it is highly probable. This is where the local conflict and the global opportunism intersect flawlessly. The Kremlin has declined to comment on the reports of sharing intelligence with Tehran, but they are very quick to emphasize that communication channels remain open. If we look at the material outcomes, it is entirely plausible that Russia's public mediation offers are a sophisticated facade.
Because prolonged instability serves their bottom line.
Exactly. By offering complex, multi-stage mediation proposals, which Dmitry Peskov himself admitted require immense patience and a long runway, Russia can appear as a responsible global stakeholder while quietly benefiting from the protracted instability. The high oil prices fund their own initiatives, and the Middle East chaos distracts the United States from the European theater.
I think it is highly speculative to suggest Russia is deliberately prolonging a highly volatile regional war simply for oil revenue, especially when Putin is directly calling the U.S. president to present de-escalation options. A wider war carries massive risks for Moscow, too. But let's shift focus to the other global power you mentioned, because the rhetoric coming out of Beijing right now is equally fascinating.
It is. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has stepped into this volatile space, portraying Beijing as a major pillar of stability in a world facing growing geopolitical turmoil.
And he is using very specific language to do it.
I want to drive the debate toward Wang Yi's specific language, actually, because it is incredibly revealing. China is not merely acting as a peacemaker here. Beijing is utilizing this crisis as a geopolitical weapon to systematically erode United States legitimacy. Look at the specific phrasing Wang Yi uses. He asserts that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries in the Gulf must remain inviolable, and then explicitly warns that planning color revolutions and orchestrating regime change is not popular.
We should unpack that term for a moment. When he says color revolutions, he is using a very loaded phrase.
Very loaded. Most people hear color revolutions and might not immediately catch the weight of it. He is basically referring to those Western-backed pro-democracy movements we saw in post-Soviet states, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. By using that specific term, he is not speaking like a neutral mediator. That is a direct, calculated indictment of historical and present United States foreign policy. He is framing the U.S. as a destabilizing force that overthrows governments.
And he pairs that critique with China's own alternative framework.
Right. Wang Yi insists that Middle East affairs should be decided independently by the countries of the region, while simultaneously offering to actively implement China's global security initiative. What does that actually mean? It means condemning the use of force, positioning themselves as a genuine friend and strategic partner to the region, and attempting to step into the vacuum created by what they frame as destructive American aggression. They want to be the new guarantor of regional stability.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I completely agree that China is using the moment to posture on the world stage. But we must recognize that this posturing is ultimately performative.
Performative? You don't think it carries real weight?
Not in the immediate context of stopping the violence, no. Wang Yi's grand statements about a global security initiative and returning to fair and equal dialogue are entirely nullified by the hard realities on the ground. China's calls to return to the negotiations table as quickly as possible are utterly meaningless when Syed Abbas Araki goes on television and says negotiations are strictly off the agenda.
But it builds a long-term narrative.
All they want. The hard reality of Iranian missiles and drones, coupled with the systemic destruction of Iranian leadership, cited by the United States, absolutely supersedes diplomatic posturing from thousands of miles away. China's rhetoric might be a fascinating study in soft power diplomacy, but it lacks the hard power leverage required to force either Washington or Tehran to change their behavior. The combatants are operating on a logic of existential survival and military dominance. They are not going to halt a war simply because Beijing wishes to implement a new security framework.
I would argue that dismissing China's maneuver as merely performative really underestimates the long-term structural damage being done to the global order.
How so?
It isn't just about forcing an immediate ceasefire today. It is about who holds the moral and diplomatic high ground tomorrow. When Wang Yi says that resorting to arms will only fuel new hatred and create new crisis, and contrast that with Beijing's principle that peace is paramount, he isn't just talking to Washington and Tehran. He is speaking to the broader global South.
He is building an audience.
He is building a coalition. He is speaking to nations who are watching the destruction and concluding that the current U.S.-led security architecture is fundamentally unstable. Even if China cannot stop the missiles today, their diplomatic opportunism is successfully isolating the United States. And returning to the direct combatants, the very fact that Iran feels emboldened to outright reject ceasefire requests from France, Russia, and China suggests they feel they have a strategic backstop.
A backstop provided by this new multipolar environment?
Yes. The fact that the Iranian Foreign Ministry can publicly acknowledge that these global powers are willing to act to stop this war and simply brush them off saying the ultimate decision rests with us demonstrates how this fractured global environment has given regional actors unprecedented defiance. They know the major powers are divided, so they can afford to say no.
But that defiance is exactly my point. Tehran's defiance is rooted in their own assessment of the damage they have inflicted on the global economy and their maximalist demand that the United States accept full responsibility. It is a deeply inward-looking bilateral obsession. As we look to summarize our positions in light of this discussion, I maintain that until Washington and Tehran can reconcile their vastly different assessments of the military and economic reality, this war will continue to be driven by their irreconcilable objectives because of the different scoreboards.
Exactly. You have a U.S. president who believes the opponent's leadership is decimated and the war is a brief excursion. You have an Iranian establishment that believes they hold the upper hand and have delivered devastating blows to Western economic interests. When both sides genuinely believe they are winning, or at least that the cost of conceding is vastly higher than the cost of continuing, the conflict becomes locked in a self-sustaining loop. External powers can posture all they want, but the primary barrier remains the direct clash of these two mutually exclusive realities.
And my position remains that this conflict has clearly metastasized beyond a simple bilateral war. It has become a strategic theater for Russia and China to exploit vulnerabilities and reshape the global security architecture. The direct combatants may be locked in their own realities, but the prolonged nature of the crisis is being actively subsidized by the strategic opportunism of external powers.
You see them as the enablers of the prolonged conflict?
Absolutely. Russia benefits economically from the energy market disruptions and utilizes the diplomatic cover to deflect from its own war in Ukraine. China utilizes the chaos to